In the centuries of history of Imperial China, a prestigious group of men who have been castrated, meaning they had their private parts cut off, became notorious for dominating the Forbidden City. As the only men allowed to serve in the imperial palace and be around the emperor's 1,000-women harem, eunuchs were trusted, lowly servants in the ancient royal court. But why did people want to become eunuchs? How did they function as men without their penis, such as urinating or even having sex? Keep watching till the end of the video to know all the secrets about being a Chinese eunuch in the Imperial China. Welcome back to Binge History, where we will be speaking of the daily life of a eunuch in China's imperial court. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more content just like this one and turn on post notifications. With all that done, let's travel back in time to witness the life of Chinese eunuchs. There are different reasons why people became eunuchs. A good number of those who became eunuchs were kids who had to because of their parents. Parents would get a lot of money for giving out their sons, but they also thought that their children would have a much better life in the palace. A good example was the last Chinese eunuch, Sun Yaoting. A eunuch went through the torturous castration process and went off to look for a position in the palace in order to gain enough power to destroy his village landlord who bullied his family for years. Grown-up men, some even married with no financial capability to live a comfortable life, preferred emasculation to a life of suffering and poverty. On the other hand, there were some men who didn't become eunuchs because they had to stuff their bank accounts. Since the reign of Emperor Guangwu of the Han Dynasty, it was ordered that criminals with death sentences were castrated instead. So these men became eunuchs not because they were looking for greener pastures, but because they were criminals. A small hut was used for the operation. The local anesthetic in those times was hot chili paste, and the disinfectant was plain hot water that had pepper mixed in it. The blade that was used to remove the male's genitals was a sharp, curved knife about 14.5 centimeters long. Daozi Jiang, or the knifer, was responsible for the prospective eunuch throughout the processes, including the healing stage too. The knifer collected 6 taels, which is equal to USD $84 today for the operation. A man would part the patient's legs and hold them down because the patient's constant jerking during the process. The knifer, to start, would ask the prospective eunuch, "Will you regret it or not?" If the man starts to doubt, the operation would be stopped instantly. But if he says no, the process would begin. As bad as the process may have been, it was excruciatingly painful after the procedure. After the amputation, a spigot was inserted inside the urethra to prevent strictures and removed after 3 days. Instead of resting right after the operation, the eunuch had to walk around for hours with little help before he was allowed to even sit. Then he wasn't allowed to drink water or urinate for a good 3 days. After that, if urine flowed out, the surgery was a success. Otherwise, it meant certain death. The eunuch recovered usually after 100 days, not completely though, but then he had to head straight to work at the imperial palace. Overall, the knifer was successful in 98% of his operations. Becoming a eunuch did not mean one's genitals would be thrown in the trash can or bags. After the castration, the new eunuchs were to go collect their bao, or genitals, if you may, which was then preserved in a liquid in a container until death. The bao was needed especially if they wanted to get promoted. They could only get promoted after a series of tests, which included an inspection of their bao. Eunuchs who lost their bao one way or another would borrow, rent, or buy new ones. Yep, apparently you could buy new genitals. Eunuchs also believed that they had to be buried with their bao so that they could enter the afterlife as complete men. Emasculation distorts the supply of testosterone to the body, and so eunuchs sounded like little girls. They could not control their bladders, so they often wet their beds and clothes, and this is why they were often referred to as smelly. They were also really weak to carry out strenuous physical activities. Beard growth stopped completely. Eunuchs walked really slowly and were taught to walk with their toes pointing outwards. This made them easily recognizable from a distance. Eunuchs who were castrated when they were kids lost all their muscles, had a lot of body fat, and their flesh got really soft and flaccid. If you were a eunuch during that time, you were required to preserve the air of sacredness and secrecy that permeated the imperial presence. Eunuchs were water fetchers, watchmen, gardeners, and so they also did the work normally done by cooks and scullery maids. They were involved in every aspect of life in the palace. They also did really small domestic jobs like making the ruler's bed, bathing him, cutting his hair, carrying him in his litter, or even relaying messages. Most of them started out as servants, but they had the opportunities along the line to rise above the ranks of a servant. Except for the emperor and his family, eunuchs were the only males allowed inside the Chinese imperial court. They were guardians of the emperor's harems, consorts, and concubines, whose virtue must be closely guarded. The omnipresence of eunuchs served a dual purpose: to watch over the emperor's hundreds of concubines and consorts, and to ensure that every child born within the palace is of emperor's blood. As the only men allowed to work and serve in the imperial family within the Forbidden City, the jobs of eunuchs were very diverse. Eunuchs with a predilection for entertainment form entertainment troupes to entertain the women in the palace. During the late Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in China, the salaries of eunuchs varied from 2 to 4 silver taels per month, which is $49 to $98 US today, and the highest salary a eunuch could be up to 12 taels or $294 US. Apparently, the condition for employment of eunuchs into high-ranking positions was that, since they were unable to have children, they would not be enticed to usurp power and start a dynasty. However, many eunuchs did desire power and even manipulated child emperors to control the palace and national policies. One of them was Zhao Gao of the Qin dynasty, who was reportedly castrated when he was a kid because his parents were criminals. Desertion was a serious and common crime among eunuchs that was not taken lightly. If you as a eunuch got tired of life in the palace and ran away, your absence was immediately reported to something like a police agency whose task was to always find fugitive eunuchs. There were diverse stages of punishment depending on how many times they'd been caught escaping the palace. First-timers were put in prison for 2 months and were flogged before being taken back to work. If a eunuch was caught a second time, he had to wear a wooden board around his neck, called a kong, for 2 months, and the third time, he would be banished for 2.5 years. After the punishments, the eunuch would always return to work at the palace. Eunuchs knew most of the secrets of the court, and so once a eunuch began serving the imperial family, it was very rare for him to be allowed to leave. Even though desertion attracted strict consequences, eunuchs continued to run away or even commit suicide. On rare occasions, eunuchs were permitted to leave the palace either because they were sick or they had to retire, but life outside the palace was not exactly better. Because they were usually seen as lowly servants, eunuchs were often rejected by society and even their own family members. They were often shunned by most societal institutions. Most emperors practically grew up with eunuchs. Eunuchs were their friends, caretakers, and confidants. In some of the dramas we watch, you realize some were cared for by eunuchs even more than their parents. Such reason, plus the fact that eunuchs had no penis, they tended to be trusted by the emperors. Unfortunately, these emperors were not entirely right about this. While sex without a penis might sound weird, it is not something impossible. Many maids, concubines, imperial consorts, and even empresses were reported to have sexual relations with their eunuch servants. One such high-profile example is that of Empress Hu of the Ming Dynasty, who engaged in what were known as immoral games with her eunuch servants. The eunuchs would often pleasure the concubines, consorts, princesses via fingers or by giving them oral sex, according to some reports. In some rare cases where the penis was not completely severed, the eunuch would engage in intercourse with the concubines. Oh, and just in case you find yourself somewhere that looked like the imperial palace after going back in time, and you find out your genitals are gone, don't be too confused, and congratulations, you are now one of the emperor's most trusted men. And because you've watched this video, I hope life in the palace would be much easier for you. Thank you so much for watching Binge History. Until the next video, goodbye!